Since Apple's latest iPad announcements, featuring the release of the M2 iPad Pro and the new base model, I've been trying to make sense of the iPad lineup. And this got me to thinking about how the lineup has changed and evolved over the years since the launch of the original iPad. So I thought I'd make a video where we run through the last 12 years. Yeah, it's only been 12 years since that original iPad launch. And then we'll see whether we can make any sense of Apple's strategy. Do they have some sort of master plan, or are they just making it up as they go along? There are currently 6 different models on sale, all of which offer basically the same iPad experience, but with wildly different pricing. And with so much overlap between the models, it does feel a little bit confused and a bit cluttered, and perhaps a difficult thing for consumers to navigate. So what is Apple's thinking here, and how do you choose the right model? When Steve Jobs unveiled the first generation iPad in January 2010, I remember at the time thinking it just looked like a comically large iPhone. And there were many people who were wondering, who is going to want a large tablet that runs a phone operating system? And why has Apple picked a name that sounds suspiciously like a sanitary towel brand? But Apple knew better, and the iPad has become somewhat ubiquitous since. Back then, of course, you had just one model, which you could have with Wi-Fi or Wi-Fi plus 3G. And we'll put the specs up for the various models as we go to give some points of comparison. iPad 2 came just over a year later in March 2011, now offering a choice of white or black on the front panel. And it actually replaced the original iPad, so we still just had one iPad model to choose from. I remember going to buy this model on launch day, and I'd reserved the 16GB model in white at a local retailer, and they weren't allowed to sell them before 1 PM on launch day. But as I turned up at 12:55, I saw a young lady leaving the store with an iPad in hand, and that actually turned out to be my reserved iPad, so I had to pony up some more money for the 32GB version. To balance out the pain of that experience, I actually managed to win an iPad 2 3G model in a competition that I never entered. I got this random email one day from the company eBuyer.com saying that I'd won an iPad, and I thought it was a scam, but no, they did actually send me an iPad, which I stuck on eBay, and that made up for the extra I had to pay on launch day. Anyway, I digress. The third generation iPad came the following year in March 2012, but it didn't replace the iPad 2. That continued to be sold. And the iPad 3 only lasted 7 months. This iPad 3 featured a Retina high-resolution display, it had a faster chip, and in some countries the cellular model offered 4G support. So now we've got these 2 models in the lineup. We've got the latest cutting-edge model and then a more affordable, established model. And that makes sense. They both look the same with the same black and white colour options, so not too confusing for the consumer. iPad 4th Gen arrived in November of the same year, and it replaced the 3rd generation model, but not the 2nd generation model. It had a faster chip again, and was also the introduction of the Lightning port to the iPad range. There was even a 128GB storage option for the first time. Now, as we said, the iPad 2 was still being sold alongside it as the cheaper option, but at the same time, the lineup then got a 3rd model, the iPad mini. It featured similar specs to the iPad 2, albeit with that new Lightning connector, and the mini just offered a smaller form factor at a slightly higher price, and the option of silver or space grey colourways. Overall, the lineup though continued to make sense because you've got a standard iPad now effectively in 2 sizes, and then a more premium version in 1 size, but with that Retina display and more performance. And it's from here on that things get more complicated for a while, because Apple then released an iPad Air in October 2013. It was a nice upgrade with much better performance thanks to that A7 chip, but an upgrade to which model? Initially, it replaced the 4th generation iPad as the premium model in the lineup, and that venerable iPad 2 continued to be sold, presumably whilst Apple were clearing out the warehouses. From Q2 in 2014, the 4th generation went back on sale again for a while, again probably just to clear out stock, and that happened until the iPad Air 2 was released in October 2014. Along with the iPad Air 1st generation, Apple released the 2nd generation iPad mini. Now that also got a Retina display and the same A7 chip that was found in the original iPad Air. The iPad mini 1st generation though continued to be sold alongside the 2nd generation mini. iPad Air 2 introduced a thinner and lighter chassis, and we got Touch ID for the first time. It got the A8X chip and 2GB of RAM. There was a gold finish added to the silver and space grey. Consumers then could go for the latest and greatest iPad Air 2, or they could pick up the 1st generation iPad Air for less. And the same was true in the smaller size as well. iPad Mini 3 didn't really change much over the iPad Mini 2. It was still the same A7 chip, but it added Touch ID. Not really a massive difference between the two generations that were being sold simultaneously. It felt a bit like the Mini 3 was a stopgap release because just under a year later in September 2015, the iPad Mini 4 came about. And the Mini 4 was a redesign. It had a thinner chassis. It got the A8 chip and 2GB of RAM, but retained those same gold, silver and space grey finishes. And so finally the lineup kind of made sense again. Two different specs of iPad Air and two different specs of iPad Mini. But that lasted all of 2 months, because in November 2015 we saw the release of the first 12.9-inch iPad Pro. With its more powerful A9X chip and 4GB of RAM, it represented a big step up over the Air and the Mini, and it came with the option of Apple Pencil. Now that was a big differentiating factor. So we've got the 2 generations of the standard iPad, 2 generations of the mini iPad, and now this more powerful, larger iPad with pencil support. It all made sense. There was an iPad for everybody. Except that in March of 2016, the 9.7-inch Pro arrived, which had mostly the same specs, although it only had 2 gigs of RAM instead of 4. And at this point, Apple stopped offering the cheaper iPad Air first generation. So now the iPad Pro becomes the premium model, whilst the iPad Air 2 is the more accessible standard model. But is it a smaller Pro or a more premium standard iPad? That would depend on the perspective of the consumer. And no doubt lots bought the Pro who would have been perfectly well served with the Air. And just to keep us all on our toes, Apple launched a 5th generation standard iPad in March 2017, which ended the sales of iPad Air 2 and iPad Mini 2. This standard iPad had the A9 chip with 2GB of RAM. There were 32GB and 128GB storage options and the usual gold, silver and space grey finishes. Apple was able to offer this model at a starting price of $329, which was a bargain really. It was the iPad for everyone. And there was no need for Apple to maintain those previous generation models alongside the new models to provide that cheaper option anymore. And so the lineup changed again. We've got a reasonably priced entry-level device, a mini version, a premium 9.7-inch with a Pro label, and a 12.9-inch which actually could be considered Pro. And speaking of the Pro iPads, in June of 2017 they got an upgrade. Both models got the A10X chip, 4 gigs of RAM and a 512GB top storage option. The smaller model got a slightly larger screen at 10.5 inches. And the screens on both models got ProMotion, which is Apple's variable refresh rate technology, allowing a maximum of 120Hz. March 2018 introduced the 6th generation iPad, now with an A10 chip and support for Apple Pencil, and a new third-party stylus, the Logitech Crayon. The pricing remained the same, but having support for Apple Pencil arguably confused the lineup, and it took a bit of a bite out of the market for the smaller iPad Pro. Pencil support no longer being a Pro feature meant that anyone who simply wanted a standard size iPad with drawing and note-taking support probably could do fine with the entry model. Apple really needed to differentiate the models a bit more, and they did that in October 2018 with the announcement of 2 new and completely redesigned iPad Pro models. In fact, we're still using the same chassis design today with these flat edges. Now, these particular tablets got the very excellent A12X Bionic chip, which in fact is still brilliant today, and there was a 1TB storage option. If you went for that maximum storage, you got 6GB of RAM instead of 4. The displays were better and brighter, featuring Tap to Wake, and Touch ID got ditched in favour of Face ID. It was a sleek new design with no home button, so the bezels were thinner, and the whole chassis was thinner overall. But the differences didn't stop there. Apple gave the new iPad Pro models a USB-C port to replace Lightning, opening up much faster interfacing with things like external storage. And of course, there was the new 2nd generation Apple Pencil with its wireless magnetic charging. Overall, these iPads were a huge step up, and they created quite a gulf in the lineup between the entry-level iPad and these premium Pro devices. Now sure, there was still the Mini option, but the iPad Mini 4 was 3 years old at this point, and long overdue a refresh, which came in March of 2019. I remember the iPad Mini 5 quite fondly as being a fantastic tablet. I had one and I absolutely loved it. It offered more performance than the standard iPad because it had the A12 chip inside and 3GB of RAM. The chassis didn't change though, which disappointed some at the time, but it was a welcome and long overdue addition to the lineup. Now it retailed at $399, so $70 more than the standard iPad, but it did have more performance and double the default storage at 64GB. So for folks who wanted a smaller form factor, it was a great deal. And of course, it brought Apple Pencil support for the 1st generation Pencil. At the same time, Apple reintroduced the iPad Air as a more premium version of the standard iPad. The Air 3 also got the A12 and 3 gigs of RAM, along with support for that first generation pencil, meaning stylus support was now featured throughout the range. But the range has again grown in complexity, though I guess it sort of made sense. There was such a gap between the standard iPad and the redesigned Pros that the iPad Air slotted right in the middle as a more premium iPad. It offered more performance, a lighter chassis, and more storage by default, so it represented a decent halfway house between the standard iPad and the Pro. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that Apple had perfected the lineup by this point, because there's an iPad in the range for everyone, and having that entry-level model at $329 was particularly significant for the education market. So, great work from Apple, but they never leave anything alone, do they? We got a minor update to the iPad in September 29, the iPad 7th generation. It featured a slightly larger display at 10.2 inches and came with 3GB of RAM. A smart keyboard connector enabled the use of a keyboard cover, and it was still available at the same price, so that was a nice mid-term update. Then in March 2020, the two Pro models got a spec bump too, with the A12Z or Z chip, which in fairness didn't make any real-world difference over the A12X apart from marginal graphics improvements. The RAM though jumped to 6GB across the board, and the default storage went to 128GB. The camera module was updated with LiDAR capabilities, which opened up more possibilities for Pro users. It was around this time that the Magic Keyboard that I have here was released as well. It is very expensive for a keyboard, but it does dramatically change the usefulness of the iPad Pro, and I did a video on that which you can watch here. In September of 2020, iPad 8 was released, now featuring the A12 chip, which provided a significant performance boost, and that same great entry price was maintained, along with now a discounted $299 price for education, a great move from Apple. At the same time as that release, the iPad Air 4 was announced, with an all-new chassis design. I say all new, but basically it looked the same as the iPad Pro 11-inch, but with more colour choices. We've got the A14 Bionic chip and 4GB of RAM, and support for the second generation Apple Pencil, which confused the lineup again by seriously narrowing the gap between the Air and the 11-inch Pro, and widening the gap between the entry-level iPad and the Air. And the pricing reflected this too, because the Air now started at $599. I bought one of these at launch time and was really astonished at just how good it was. In some areas it was outperforming the A12X in my Pro. Now true, there are some key differences between the Air and the Pro. The display on the Air is 60Hz, and if you're an avid pencil user then you'd notice the difference. But many people wouldn't. And the Air doesn't have Face ID, instead it has Touch ID on the top button, but really these are relatively minor differences in real-world use for most people. The iPad Air 4 is a brilliant iPad, don't get me wrong, but clearly Apple is going to need to widen the gap to the Pro models again, which they did in April 2021. The chassis looked the same as the outgoing models, though it is a hair thicker and it is noticeably heavier. It spoils the balance point actually on the Magic Keyboard if you use the Magic Keyboard in your lap. The big change though was that Apple put the M1 Mac chip into the iPad. This is a huge upgrade over the A12X and Z models, but it's not really an upgrade that most people would see in real world use. I had both the A12X and the M1 model of this 12.9-inch iPad, and they really don't feel any different. The limiting factor is iPadOS, which just isn't able to make use of all of the features of a chip that was specifically designed for Macs. There is a common misconception that the M1 is just a rebadge of what would have been the A14X, but this isn't the case. Whilst the A chips and the M chips do use the same building blocks, things like the processor cores, they are different in fairly fundamental ways. But what would be the point in Apple designing an X version of the A14 at a time when supply chain issues are disrupting the industry? Isn't it much simpler to reduce the number of SKUs and just put the M1 in the iPad? It'll work fine, and it doesn't really matter that the iPad won't be able to use all of the features of the chip, because for Apple it simplified production and lowered costs. It also meant that Apple could give the iPad Pro USB 4 with Thunderbolt 3, not to be confused with Thunderbolt 4, which is only available on the M1 Pro, Max and Ultra chips. But Thunderbolt support is not actually that useful on iPadOS, other than for connecting storage devices, which don't actually perform as fast as they do on Macs with the M1 chip. Better external monitor support would come later, but at the time of release, it left some of us scratching our heads. And many, including me, thought that Apple was perhaps using the M1 because it was planning to bring iPad versions of Pro apps like Final Cut and Logic. But sadly, that hasn't happened, leaving many buyers a bit frustrated. It's like buying a V8 muscle car only to find that you can only use 4 of the cylinders. A big upgrade for the 12.9-inch model was this mini LED display. It offers stunning brightness for HDR content and rich contrast, but it also does have a shadow around the edge of the display where the mini LED backlighting doesn't quite stretch all the way. The 11-inch model confusingly remains an LCD display. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Both models come with 8 GB of RAM as standard, but if you buy a model with 1 TB or 2 TB of storage, you get 16 gigs of RAM. But again, without Pro apps, this makes little difference in the real world. We also saw the introduction of Center Stage, a webcam trick where the iPad can follow your movement and reframe the image accordingly. But since most people will use their iPad in a landscape mode, perhaps on the Magic Keyboard, and the camera is still on the top of the device for portrait mode, the effect is quite odd. Because the camera's to the side, it looks like you're staring away from the person you're talking to. So in itself, this was a slightly confusing release that really just serves to show the limitations of iPadOS, because the hardware is now ahead of the operating system's ability to use it. Next we go to September 2021 and the iPad mini 6th generation launch, the current model. The chassis was redesigned to follow the design language of the Air and Pro iPads, reducing the bezel size and allowing for a larger display. It gets a USB-C port and support for the 2nd generation Apple Pencil. And under the hood is the A15 Bionic chip with 4 gigs of RAM. It should be brilliant, and it is. I bought one in fact, but I had to return it due to the jelly scroll issue. Apple repositioned the display chips in this model for landscape use. So when you use it in portrait mode, you notice this effect where one side of the display is refreshing slightly ahead of the other. Now, all cheaper LCDs do this, but the timing on the iPad mini 6 was just at that awkward point where it became quite noticeable. And I did a video on this, which you can watch here. Some people aren't bothered by it, but I found it was making me feel a little bit nauseous. Otherwise, it was a great update to the iPad mini. And at that same event, Apple released the iPad 9. Now it has an A13 Bionic chip, and the base storage was finally increased to 64 GB. But other than these changes, it was broadly the same as the previous model. But it offered even greater value because Apple retained that $329 starting price. And in fact, iPad 9 is still on sale for that same starting price, at least in the US. I'll talk about UK pricing in a moment. But this is hugely important for the iPad range, having that affordable entry-level model with the slightly older tech inside, but still offering that same great iPad experience. And it's a great marketing tool for Apple to tap into the education market and indoctrinate future customers amongst the youth, people who may buy into the Apple ecosystem and their subscription services, which is where the real profit is made. And jumping forward to March of 2022, Apple released the iPad Air 5, and they put the M1 chip in it. It confused me at the time, and frankly it still does, because again the gap between the Air and the Pro has been narrowed, and it makes the decision between an Air and an 11-inch Pro much more difficult. Of course, without the app and the OS support, you can't get all of the benefits of the M1 on the Air just like you can on the Pro, apart from one area I neglected to mention, and that's graphics performance. If you like to play games on your iPad, the M1 offers considerably more GPU horsepower for your game to tap into, although it does depend on the game, of course, since most developers will optimize their software so that it runs on all of the iPad models. But it is now possible for developers to access the additional memory and to potentially provide an enhanced experience on more powerful iPads. And this brings us then to the most recent releases at the time of recording in October 2022. We've got a new iPad 10th generation. And if you're thinking it looks similar to the iPad Air, you'd be right. It's the same chassis. There are more vibrant color choices, but otherwise it's pretty much the same. It gets the A14 Bionic, which was in the iPad Air 4, and 4 GB of RAM. The home button is gone and Touch ID is moved to the power button, just like the Air. It also gets the USB-C port, but for some bizarre reason, it doesn't support the 2nd generation Apple Pencil. This means that you now need a USB-C to Lightning adapter in order to pair and charge a 1st generation Pencil, which is just a bizarre choice, and it seems to be a deliberate decision to perhaps cut the cost of the wireless charging element, or maybe just to punish consumers for buying the entry-level iPad. Except it's not the entry-level iPad anymore because iPad 9 is still being sold at the entry price, and this new iPad is $120 more expensive for the base model at $449. Apple needs a cheap entry-level iPad, so presumably that means that they'll continue to sell iPad 9 until iPad 11 is released. And then we've gone full circle back to that old model of selling previous generation iPads for less. But why would you buy an actual iPad Air over this iPad? Aside from gaming and a very few apps, the additional performance of the M1 won't be noticeable in day-to-day use. It's really just that pencil support that becomes the differentiating factor. Except of course Apple also chose to introduce a change to the selfie camera location on the iPad. So on iPad 10 it's now top center in landscape orientation. So that means your video calls in landscape mode where you'll actually appear to be looking at the person you're talking to. And then of course there's the new Magic Keyboard Folio, which features a rear magnetic cover with a kickstand and a detachable keyboard and trackpad. Arguably a better solution than the Magic Keyboard that's used by the Pro models in the Air, even if it isn't a unique design like Apple claimed. Surface Pro anyone? The new Magic Keyboard Folio though does get function keys, something sadly missing from the Magic Keyboard. Presumably Apple has released an updated version of the Magic Keyboard with function keys. No. The cheaper iPad gets the more Pro keyboard than the Pro. Some confusing choices then, and a confusing lineup as we now have 4 different 10.9 or 11-inch models to choose from. Still one mini and the 2 Pro models. And of course, they've just been updated as well. You might be thinking that the Pro update would include that landscape camera location, and you'd be wrong. And you might be thinking that the 11-inch Pro will get a mini LED display like its big brother, and you'd be wrong. Instead, Apple has put the M2 chip in the Pro iPads, so now there's a little bit more performance that you still can't really access unless Apple makes fundamental changes to iPadOS and unless Pro apps start appearing. There are some rumours doing the rounds that Apple is working on a cut-down version of macOS to run on the M2 iPad Pro. If that's true, it'll probably confuse people even more. Though I've always thought that an iPad which can work as an iPad and then work like a Mac when you dock it would be a great idea. Microsoft have already proven that concept with their brilliant Surface Pro, and Samsung of course has its DeX mode, so perhaps it's inevitable that Apple will create a detachable device that runs macOS. It does already have the iPad Pro with the right chip in it to do it. But if they were to do that, let's hope they don't artificially limit it to the M2 chips, because the M1 is just as capable. And when it comes to Pro apps, there's still no noise from Apple on Final Cut or Logic, but Blackmagic Design have announced that they are bringing a version of DaVinci Resolve to iPad. I switched to Resolve a couple of years back, so this is great news for me, and great news for anybody wanting to do quick edits and colouring on the go. Resolve has been upfront in supporting the transition to Apple Silicon on the Mac, even offering better performance than Final Cut at times. And with their new cloud-based project server, it means that I can do a rough cut on my iPad and then continue where I left off on my laptop or desktop machines. Pretty great. But of course you could argue, why not just use your laptop? And for me that is a valid point, because I have the M1 Max 14-inch, which is just as portable as an iPad, but it has the full studio version of Resolve on it and much more performance to boot. But not everybody has this, and I'm sure there are plenty of folks out there who would love a video editing solution on iPad which integrates seamlessly with their desktop application. And if you're editing with ProRes codecs, you'll be able to get some more benefit from that M2 chip, since it has a dedicated encoder and decoder built into the chip for ProRes. And this could be a game changer for film crews on location. In the process of all of this, Apple has increased prices. Now it's true that global inflation is on the rise, but some of these increases seem to be in excess of that. And speccing these machines beyond those base configurations is painful. Let's take the iPad 10 and just spec one up. You pick your favourite finish, then you have to choose between 64 gigs or 256 of storage. Now given what we're going to be spending, we want the iPad to last, so let's choose 256 gigs. And we're already up $150 on the entry price. And this is just pure profiteering, as you can buy a good quality 1TB SSD for less than that. We call it the Apple tax, and the pricing is always very carefully designed to make you want to upgrade and to give Apple significantly more profit margin in the process. Next we choose Wi-Fi, or Wi-Fi plus cellular. I personally have unlimited data on my phone and I can tether on that plan, so I always choose Wi-Fi. And we won't personalise the iPad with engraving because that will reduce resale value in the future. Let's add one of those first generation pencils, and you'll note if we do that the new USB-C adapter is already included. But if you've got a pencil already that you want to reuse, you'll need to spend $9 on the adapter. whilst we're at it, we might as well add the Magic Keyboard Folio. And this brings us then to the eye-watering total of $947 for the standard iPad. You can get the M1 MacBook Air for less than that. True, the iPad with detachable keyboard and trackpad, not to mention pencil and touch input, is arguably more flexible, but if you're buying a machine to get work done, you're much better off with the MacBook Air. For fun, let's just price up the same iPad in the UK. We'll choose all the same options, but this time you'll see we get to the total of £1,067, the equivalent of $1,206 at today's exchange rate. And again, the M1 MacBook Air is available from Amazon at the moment for £168 less than that. To be fair, the US price doesn't include state sales tax, whereas the UK price includes our standard ludicrous 20% tax. Without the tax, it comes to $889, which is about $1,005 at today's rate, which is more than it costs in the US. So as per usual, we're getting fleeced here in the UK. And it doesn't stop there. The new M2 12.9-inch iPad Pro is £250 more than the M1 version was at launch. That's a 25% price increase. Even with inflation and the drop in sterling against the dollar, that's just taking the mick. The iPad mini has gone from £479 to £569, and the Air has gone from £569 to £669. The new iPad 10 starts at £499, and even that iPad 9, which retained its same $329 price in the US, has gone up from £319 to £369 here. Now, I don't believe this level of price gouging of the British public was necessary. The pound will recover once the governmental change here is stabilised, and I wonder whether Apple will be as quick to drop their prices when it does. So what do we make of all this? It feels like we've got a very confused iPad lineup. Presumably Apple does have a plan, and perhaps we're just partway through that plan being implemented. Things are certainly being slowed down by the various supply chain constraints. Perhaps the new standard iPad will again take over from the iPad Air, the two products merging into one at some point, because we don't need both of them, especially if there's an 11-inch iPad Pro at the top end and a previous generation iPad at the cheaper end. Apple really needs to consolidate the feature set and clearly define which features are available at each level. It shouldn't be the case that the top models don't get basic features that the cheaper models are getting. And Apple absolutely needs to stop with the stupid artificial limitations, especially with the Pencil. If all the iPads are to support Pencil, then they should all support the second generation Pencil, with backwards compatibility for first generation Pencil to avoid unnecessary e-waste. The larger models should have the landscape camera, with the exception of the Mini, because it would be more normal to hold that in portrait mode. On the next iteration of the Mini, perhaps Apple could re-optimize that screen for portrait use instead of landscape, and in the process get rid of that horrible jelly scrolling effect. It wasn't acceptable at £480, and it sure as heck isn't acceptable on a device costing £570. And the Magic Keyboard should get function buttons. And for goodness sake, put a mini LED display in the 11-inch Pro. The only difference between those two models should be the size. And we ought to have a clear line drawn between Pro and non-Pro iPads. If Apple is going to put M chips in the iPad, it should be the Pro models that get them. And we'll take it as read that Apple will be doing something about iPadOS to improve performance. And hopefully in time, that will bring more Pro apps. Whether it's a better iteration of iPadOS or some cut-down version of macOS, we don't care. We just want to be able to use the full performance of our iPad. When it comes to the consumer iPads, we don't need two premium models. We don't need to have the iPad 10 and the iPad Air 5. So let's just have one device and an iPad mini, both using similar specs. And for the price we're paying, let's have ProMotion LCD displays in there and fast A-series chips. And it's important to maintain an entry-level model at an affordable price, using older chips and older display technology. And that would make sense then as a complete lineup, because with the range of accessories available, that would allow everyone to find their perfect iPad without having to make compromises. So those are my conclusions. What are yours? Does Apple already make your perfect iPad, or do you find the lineup a bit confusing? And if you were saving for a new iPad, how have the price hikes affected you? If you were planning to upgrade, have you decided to wait a little longer? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section, and please consider subscribing, sharing, and perhaps leaving a like for the video. I'm really grateful for all of your support, and I'll see you again soon for some more geekery.